Hey guys, and welcome again to another online experience here at Pinnacle Church. If you don't know who I am Heath. I am one of the pastors here at Pinnacle, and we started a series last week where we are looking at the journeys of a guy named Paul, who was a follower of Jesus. Not long after Jesus rose from the dead, he was very influential in the early church. And last week, Caleb Simmons, one of our pastors, kicked it off, and he talked about how when it comes to the gospel, that the gospel is cross-cultural, that the gospel can go anywhere, that no matter what people's cultures are, no matter their socioeconomic background, no matter just different ways of seeing the world, that the gospel is for anyone. And if the gospel is for anyone, that means that we as Christians need to be about sharing it with anyone. And so that's what Paul did. He traveled all over the Mediterranean world, just spreading the gospel. He was so influential in the birth of the church, that early church. Matter of fact, Paul wrote about 13 letters in the New Testament that we have to various individuals and to churches. Now, here's the thing. Even the early church, though, was filled with people. And anytime you get people together, people are not always going to get along. Even when it comes to being focused on and centered on following Jesus and rallying around the gospel, because we believe the gospel is the hope for the world as Christians. Even then, though, people can disagree. And we're going to look at an instance where Paul and his good buddy Barnabas, who had made a journey together, the first missionary journey of Paul, had went all over that Mediterranean world, preaching the gospel, planting churches, being persecuted together, getting thrown in jail together, all kinds of things like that. We're going to see where they're going to have a disagreement. And you're like, okay, they had a disagreement. What's that mean for me? Well, you're going to disagree with people sometimes. You're going to have moments when you're going to disagree with things in your churches, disagree with other Christians, and how we handle those disagreements really matters. How we handle those disagreements will make a difference about how we share the gospel and interrelate and work with one another. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to go to Acts chapter 15, and that's where we'll begin. Acts 15, starting with verse 36. Look at what it says here. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let's go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Now, that's sometime later, roughly around 3 years after Paul and Barnabas took their first kind of tour around the Mediterranean world. And so Paul's like, hey, Barnabas, let's go back, let's visit these churches, and let's see how they're doing. And so they're going back to kind of do some discipleship to help strengthen up these churches. But also along the way, Paul's going to have a little different route. We'll see that in a little while. And they're going to plant some more churches. And so Barnabas, sure, let's go. Let's do this thing, right? But then look at what it says. Verse 37. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. And so right here you've got two well-meaning people who are sold out for Christ. They are partners in the mission, but yet they have two different viewpoints. And here's the thing. This is something we got to understand. Here it is. Good people can disagree about good things. When you look at this, okay, you've got Barnabas who's like, hey, let's take Mark with us. You got Paul who's like, nah, man, he deserted us. We don't need to take him. Both of those things are valid points. They're both coming from a place, not a malicious place or a bad place. They're both coming with a good point from a good place. N.T. Wright, in his biography on Paul, he said, when you look at this and you say, of course, Barnabas wanted to bring John Mark with him. Even though Mark had deserted the work, We don't know why, but he deserted them. He's like, nope, done with this, too hard, going back. But he said, of course, Barnabas wanted to bring him along because you know what Barnabas was known as an encourager. When Paul had his experience with Jesus and came to the faith, Paul had formerly been a persecutor of Christians. It was Barnabas who was one of the first people to come alongside him, to encourage him, and to walk with him in his faith. And so N.T. writes, like, of course Barnabas would be like, we got to give the young guy another chance. Just because he made this mistake, even if it was a big mistake, doesn't mean that he couldn't be useful in the future. He can learn from this mistake. I can just hear him. Barnabas would be like, Paul, come on. He can learn from this mistake. Let's bring him. He said, then you got Paul. He said, and of course, Paul, super mission focused, all about the mission, would be like, nah, man, that ain't wise. You got to think about the hardships that we experienced after he left us. He's probably not up for this. And so two valued points. And I don't think that either one of them was necessarily wrong. They were just seeing it from a different way. And that's why I say good people can disagree about good things. But then what happens? Look in verse 39. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. There it is. The band broke up. Barnabas and Paul, these two powerhouses, this powerhouse missionary team together, they could not get over their disagreement, and it says they parted ways. And if you look at that, it says it's not just that they had a disagreement, they had a sharp disagreement. It means that it got heated. It means that maybe words could have been said that they wish they could take back. It was an argument, a heated argument. And what happened out of it, they had to part ways. And notice what it says. You go on in Acts 15 and it says this: Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. He would go back to Cyprus. Barnabas and Mark, by the way, was probably Barnabas's nephew. They went back to Cyprus to do missions and ministry there on that island. But Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And so here's the thing. They part ways, but what was once one group of people doing ministry now becomes two. And here's the lesson I think that I get out of this passage. Even though they got in a row, even though they had a sharp argument and they couldn't get a win-win between the two of them, they couldn't come to an agreement about what to do, and because they couldn't, they both felt strongly about their positions, which were two valid positions, and they had to part ways. Here's the thing. God was able to do something good out of that. And here's the lesson. Sometimes, okay, we have to divide before we multiply. What do I mean by that? In this case, there was a division that happened. But because there was a division, because they divided, future multiplication of the church could happen. Now, granted, these guys had a solution in front of them the whole time. The solution was, well, okay, we'll split up. Paul, you don't think it's a good idea to take him. You go do your thing, and I'm going to go and spend some time mentoring Mark because I think it's good for his development, and that's a win-win. They ended up doing the solution. The problem was the way they got there wasn't good. They got in a fight. They sharply disagreed. It wasn't just that they were like, hey, man, I just don't agree with that, but let's just find this thing. Let's part ways. No, they got heated. But God still turned it into something good, as I said. And that's why I say sometimes in ministry, sometimes in life, sometimes in your business, sometimes with a team, you got to divide before you can multiply. It may mean that you may be in a situation where there are two valued things, two valued opinions. They're both good, and you can't get past it. And so what needs to happen is there has to be a division. I think about back in like 1970, the Beatles broke up, right? I was raised on Beatles music. Maybe you wasn't, maybe you're not a fan, but my mom loves the Beatles. I was raised on Beatles music. Still like the music to this day. I mean, you have to give credit where credit's due. They're one of the greatest bands of all time. When they came over to America, it just set the world on fire over here. I mean, you can watch the videos. 16-year-old girls just screaming and crying and going, fainting when they saw the Beatles. I don't get it, but their music's good, but I'm not going to, pass out when I hear it. But in 1970, they broke up for some interpersonal relationships and stuff. People were like, oh no, broke the band up. But anyways, they broke up. And people were like, what's going to happen? There's it. All the music's done. That's it. But that didn't happen. They broke up, and then all these guys went and had solo careers and brought us more music. Paul McCartney, look at all the music he brought. John Lennon, before he was killed, all the music he brought. George Harrison would bring music, and he'd also be an actor. And so even though there was a division and we no longer had the Beatles, we still got some great music that we're still listening to today. And so sometimes God can take a disagreement where two parties can't come to a consensus and they have to go their separate ways, and God can use that to multiply the effect of the kingdom. I mean, when you look at history, sometimes people will say, well, all these denominations, I'll hear this, denominations are man-centered. Well, guys, if we believe God is sovereign, I don't agree with that statement. Yeah, men had a part to play in different denominations, but don't you think God was in the middle orchestrating all that and using all that? Sometimes churches, they set up, churches come together, sometimes they divide. Now, I'm not talking about church splits where people get mad and take their toys and go home. That's never healthy. That's never good. But sometimes, you may be in a thing where it's like we got to divide to multiply. I look at the beautiful breadth of Christianity and all the different churches. I've always said this. Our church, we do church a certain way. We have a certain philosophy about how we reach people. We're a church anyone can come to. We really think about unchurched people in mind. Other churches do it differently, and it doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. We just reach different people. And there's even been times in our own context where people will come to me and be like, man, we really believe in what you're doing, but it's just not for us. And so I'll be like, that's a moment when there needs to be a division to multiply. That's when I'll be like, hey, let me help you find the place you need to fit in. And I got a couple places I know. You may be in a moment in your business or in an endeavor you're doing, and you're at an impasse with a partner or the people on your team, and there needs to be, as Henry Cloud says, a necessary ending to this, and you're afraid to divide, but it might mean that dividing is the best choice you can make because of the multiplication that could happen then between the two of you. Now, I want to make a disclaimer on this. You're hearing me say this. Somebody might be like, well, I'm ready to divide in my marriage. That's the one thing you don't divide to multiply, okay? I just got to say that. I thought of that as we're sitting here. But so if that's true, right? Sometimes we got to divide before we multiply, as this happened in this case. How do we do it well? Because these guys didn't do this very well. It ended up well in the end, and I'm going to tell you how that happened in a minute. But I want to share two things that we need to do, that you and I need to do. If we're kind of wrestling with this and we think maybe there needs to be an ending so there can be a new beginning, maybe there needs to be a division so that we can then see multiplication. Two things. One, you've got to choose grace and generosity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you go back to the text, and the solution was there staring them in the face the whole time. They actually ended up doing the solution. They said, hey, we'll divide our efforts. But to get to that division, they were not very graceful and they were not very generous to one another. They sharply disagreed. It's kind of sad. I love the fact that Luke, who wrote this, didn't take sides. Luke, who wrote Acts, which is kind of the history of the church, of the early church, Luke would end up being a partner with Paul. He would travel with Paul. So he knew these things firsthand. But we need to choose grace and generosity. If you come to a point where you're maybe in an organization or you're in a partnership with someone and you see that it's time, that you're at a point where you both have different views of where something needs to go, and you know there needs to be a division here, so that ultimately as we divide, perhaps we see multiplication in both of us, success on both ends. You've got to be graceful in how you do it. There doesn't need to be that heated argument and hurt feelings. You got to come at it from a place of, we're doing this out of grace for us. And see, I see this sometimes even with churches, even that sometimes it might mean that there's a division that happens. Sometimes staff members come along, and this has happened here, and it's been a good thing. A staff member will come along and be like, hey, I feel like God's calling me to do something else. And instead of me getting angry and upset, I'm like, let me help propel you out of here, understanding that as we propel you out of here to go do this other thing, you know, I'm sitting here going, no, man, you just stay here. But as we propel you out here to do this other thing, I want to bless you. I want to be generous. I want to help set you up for success. And so you need to choose grace, giving each other the benefit of the doubt and blessing each other as this division happens. And why I say that is because of what could happen in the future. And that's the second thing, is don't close the door on cooperation. You know, sometimes you would look at this and you think, well, what happened with Paul and Barnabas? Tradition tells us, church tradition, that as Barnabas went back to Cyprus, he would become a bishop there, and he would be martyred for his faith eventually. But we have church tradition. The Bible gets kind of silent on what happened afterwards. We know a lot about what happened with Paul because Luke writes about it, and we have the letters of Paul to different churches and different individuals. But in Corinthians, Paul, a good bit of time after this happened, as he writes to the church in Corinth, there's a part in there where he's making a point about something, and he mentions Barnabas as an apostle, and he does it in a very good manner. So that little tidbit in Corinthians tells us that there was still love there was still cooperation there. They were not competing with each other. They were cooperating because though they had a division, they were still on the same team. They were part of the church. I see that sometimes with churches. You know, sometimes when you plant a church, people think you're coming in to compete with them. It's like, no, we're cooperating with you to reach people. And that's why I say don't close the door on cooperation. Another thing is, what about Mark? What ended up happening to old Mark, who Paul was like, nope, no way I'm taking him on this trip. What's interesting, that you go to the last letter Paul ever wrote before he would be executed for his faith, the letter to Timothy. And in 2 Timothy 4:11, I want you to notice something. Paul is talking about how he was in jail, and he says this, only Luke is with me. Luke's the only one with him there while he's on house arrest. Here it comes, Mark, and bring him with you because he is helpful to me and my ministry. That's why you don't close the door on cooperation. We don't know, history's silent on this, about what all transpired, but Mark, who Paul was like, nope, we're not taking him, and was so adamant about that he would part ways with his best bud Barnabas. Eventually, Paul would say, when you come, Timothy, please bring Mark with you. Why? He's helpful. Think about that. I think that what happened, Barnabas took Mark down there to Cyprus to mentor him, and it worked. But I also think Mark learned a lesson from the stinging fact that he wasn't allowed to go on that trip with Paul, that probably in his mind said, I've got to do better. And along the way, he grew in his faith, he grew in his leadership, and he became a person who was valuable to the mission and to the Apostle Paul. And that's why I say, even though sometimes there has to be a division so that we can multiply, Don't close the door on what the future could be with that person and the cooperation that could happen down the road. Because we see that here in the case of Mark. And by the way, when you open up a New Testament Bible, you're going to read a gospel called the Gospel of Mark that tells the story of Jesus and his disciples. And do you know who that Mark is? This Mark right here. This Mark, who Paul was like, nope, no way is he going with me, would end up growing. And I think it's partly because a division had to happen in order for there to be multiplication of the mission, where Paul needed to take other people with him to go get done what needed to get done. Paul, when he took that second trip, he would go to some of those churches that they planted with Barnabas, but he would also go to other places. He would end up in Athens, Greece, the center of knowledge and philosophy for the ancient world, and he would preach to those ancient Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, and he would preach in the place of the center of their government. And so God used this to send him that way. I think God used Barnabas to mentor and set the stage for Mark to end up being the leader and the man that he would grow into. And even though the way it happened wasn't good, the result ended up being a multiplication of the mission. And so I guess what I'm encouraging us to say is, if we come to a point where we know there has to be a division, we don't have to do it in a way that's harsh and hard. We can be graceful and generous and open and get a win-win from each other and keep the relationship intact. It's happened in my own life in ministry with different people and different things. And there's people who, there's had to be a division in my own life, but are still friends of mine. Even though we disagree about different things, we can still partner in different ways. It's just we had to do things differently. And that's what I'm encouraging us to do here. And why do I say that? Well, because here's the thing, guys. We have to leave open the possibility that God might be doing something bigger that we can't imagine, and that if there does come a time where there needs to be a divide, there needs to be a division of the labor, there needs to be a, hey man, you go start something new. Hey, I'm gonna keep doing what I'm doing, or we're both gonna start something new, and there's gonna be a multiplication. We need to leave open the fact that God can do something bigger. And we can't shut the door on what he might do in the future because of hurt feelings, because of ego. We got to leave the relationship intact, because it might mean that there might be a mark in our future that's helpful to us. As I was thinking about this, it's the month of July. We're coming off. The 4th's been a few weeks ago, but we're still in July. And I was thinking about the July the 4th holiday, right? Did you know that there are 2 United States presidents that died on, actually 3 United States presidents died on July the 4th. But 2 of them died on the same day. It was John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now you're like, okay, big deal. What's that got to do with this sermon? Well, here's the thing. If you know anything about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, they had a very unique relationship. They didn't agree politically about much. They were political rivals and opponents, okay? They both dearly loved the country. They both dearly loved the movement. They both were part of the revolution, right? But their view of how government worked was radically different. And they were opponents. They had a period where they had a falling out. But then through a mutual friend, they came back together. And we have loads of, because back then, it's not like you could get on the phone and be like, what's up, bro? You couldn't get in your car and be like, hey man, I know you're like 3 hours away, but I'll meet you. But what they did do is they wrote. They wrote each other a lot. And we have tons of letters where these guys would write back. They would correspond on everything imaginable. They would debate on things in their letters, but they developed this friendship. And even though there had to be a division in their life and they had differing opinions, they still maintained the relationship. And in the end, they saw that they could cooperate, not compete, and they saw the good of the other. It made me think about this. I like to think in my mind that the Apostle Paul, who would write about forgive as the Lord has forgiven you, the Apostle Paul, who would write in Ephesians to bear one another's burdens and to love one another as Christ loved us, I like to think in my mind that in later years, him and Barnabas patched things up and had this type of relationship. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, when they would die on the same day, and memory is not serving me right now, but one of them, when the one died, that person's spouse said, well, at least the other one's alive. They didn't even know they both died. But it was a cool relationship. And it shows that sometimes even though we divide, there may be a multiplication, but it doesn't mean that as we divide, the friendship has to end. It just means that the mission changes. And when the mission changes, sometimes God can take what two people were doing together sometimes, and as they separate and go and do different things, God can sometimes multiply the effect. And I think we need to know that and be open to what he might do. So, hey, you may be faced with this in your life right now. You may be fearful what it is. Sometimes it's okay to divide. You might see God multiply what's going on in your life. Let me pray for us. God, it's amazing to me that you left this in Scripture, that the heroes of our faith, Lord, were people just like us. And I love that you show that even they didn't always get it right. That even though, God, in this instance, they could have handled it better, you turned it into something really good. And in the long run, Mark would be someone important to Paul. And so, God, may we take this lesson. May we learn, one, to not do what they did, to do it better than they did, but to understand sometimes the solution is to split the effort. Sometimes the solution is in a partnership to divide so that we can multiply. And those of us who may be wrestling with that right now, God, I pray you give wisdom and grace, and that if there is a division in a business or a partnership or a team, whatever way, a mission, that, God, we could do it well with grace and generosity, keeping you in the center, God. We love you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.